Can we trust the New Testament as a reliable document? Many skeptics say no, and that it is based on dated copies and filled with errors. But what does the evidence say? Christians for centuries have pointed to the evidence that we can trust the New Testament is reliable to what it originally said. So what evidence can we offer? Well, when it comes to an ancient document, the more manuscripts we have, the better. That way there is more to cross-check for accuracy and identify changes that may have happened through the process known as textual criticism. So we would obviously want more to compare with so we can get back to the original. So what do we have of the New Testament? Of the original language of the New Testament, we've over 5,800 Greek manuscripts. In Latin, we've over 10,000 manuscripts. In various other languages, we have between 5,000 and 10,000 manuscripts. So we have an extremely wide variety of New Testament manuscripts from across the ancient world we can study and compare. And with more manuscripts, the more accurate we will be at reconstructing the original through textual criticism. But even if we didn't have any manuscripts, we would still have the entire New Testament preserved in the writings of the Church Fathers. It is estimated there are over 1 million New Testament quotes in the Church Fathers alone. If there was a large amount of intentional or accidental corruption of the text, then it would be easy to trace by comparing manuscripts of different regions.
There was never a time when any one man or group of men had control over the text of the New Testament. There was never a Christian Uthman. All assertions regarding adding doctrines, changing theology, removing teachings, etc. are without merit. The Christian church was a persecuted minority without power to enforce a uniform textual transmission, as in Islam.
This is far more than any other ancient document. The second most widely attested would be Homer's Iliad, with only 1,757 copies, and then Suetonius with around 200 copies. So if one is still skeptical of the New Testament after knowing of how widely attested it is, then they should be even more skeptical of other ancient works. As scholar Dan Wallace says,
they have never thought about this other ancient literature and reflecting on what that would be like. If I'm going to be skeptical about the New Testament and I apply that skepticism to other ancient Greco-Roman literature, guess what? We immediately go back into the Dark Ages. We've eclipsed all knowledge in the last 500 years.
But not only do we have a large amount of manuscripts, but we have very early complete manuscripts and even earlier fragments. The oldest complete New Testament is within 300 years of the original, the closest of any ancient document. But we have even earlier witnesses and fragments, like this one, P52, from between 90 AD to 125 AD, and others like these, from approximately 170 AD to 220 AD. We also have a larger fragment from around this time in P75, which has 102 survived pages from Luke and John. Comparing this to other ancient documents, the earliest copy of the Iliad is far off with 500 years from its original, and Suetonius is 800 years from its original. As you can see, the New Testament is by far the closest to its original than any other ancient document. So if we are to be skeptical of the New Testament, then we should be even more skeptical of other ancient literature. In fact, we have about a dozen fragmented manuscripts dating to around the 2nd century, which represent about 40% of the entire New Testament, and we have 120 manuscripts around 300 years from the original, which is incredible compared to other ancient documents. But despite this, some scholars still argue the New Testament copies are too late and full of errors. The leading critic Bart Ehrman says, "Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the original, or copies of copies of copies of the originals. What we have are copies made later, much later, and these copies all differ from one another in many thousands of places." Well, this seems like an odd thing to say, given the evidence we just discussed. So let's divide his objection into two parts and deal with each appropriately. The first is that our earliest manuscripts are extremely far off from the originals, not even copies of copies of copies of the originals. Well, this doesn't make sense, considering our earliest fragment is within 70 years or less of the original, and several larger fragments are around 150 years from the original. So why would these not be first or second generation copies of the originals? A papyrus manuscript in public use will last on average for more than 100 years. There is also no reason to assume the originals or first generation copies were copied once and thrown away or lost. In fact, Ehrman even acknowledges that a manuscript can likely be a direct copy of one from 100 years prior to it.
Every time somebody translates the Bible, they don't say, well, I've got to take this manuscript that I translated from and destroy that now. That's stupid. We don't do that. It's never been done in the history of the church.
There is no reason to assume the originals were just copied once and forgotten, or that scribes only had one copy to pull from. In fact, early church father Tertullian even seems to suggest the originals were still around when he was writing at the end of the 2nd century. Come now, you who would indulge a better curiosity, if you would apply it to the business of your salvation, run over to the apostolic churches, in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read. The Latin word for authentic normally refers to original documents, so it appears Tertullian is saying the originals were still in the churches to that day. He specifically refers to the letters of Corinthians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Romans, and urges readers to visit these places to see the authentic writings for themselves. Even if Tertullian didn't mean the original scrolls the apostles wrote on, his testimony still tells us the Christians in his days were concerned with having accurate writings, and they were not discarding their copies as valueless, as skeptics suggest. And it's reasonable to suggest that if the manuscripts were read often, they were also copied often. And in fact, the amount of manuscripts we have today obviously suggests that. Ehrman's reasoning seems to imply New Testament copying was like a game of telephone, where a 4th century copy is a copy from one from a 3rd century, which in turn is a copy of one from the 2nd century, which is a copy of one from the 1st century, which was a copy of the original. But there is no reason to suggest the originals or the first copies were simply lost after they were copied once. Scribes could always go back to the earliest copies of their day that had survived and simply copy that. St. Irenaeus even testifies he had access to some of the earliest copies of the Book of Revelations, suggesting early copies were being preserved for accuracy and transmission. And the testimony of early church fathers indicates how sacred they considered these documents, so they were not carelessly being copied, but being held in high regard to preserve the faith passed down from the apostles. In fact, scholars Darrell Bach and Dan Wallace note the earliest manuscripts we have probably go back to around 100 AD. Two of the oldest manuscripts we have, Papyrus 75 or P75 and Codex Vaticanus or B, have an exceptionally strong agreement, and they are among the most accurate manuscripts that exist today. P75 is about 125 years older than B, yet it is not an ancestor of B. Instead, B was copied from an earlier manuscript of P75. See the detailed work of C.L. Porter. The combination of these two manuscripts in a particular reading must surely go back to the very beginning of the 2nd century. So the idea that our copies are far too late doesn't stand up to evidence, and textual criticism demonstrates we are not too far off from the originals. So what about Ehrman's other claim, that all other manuscripts have much variation and differ from one another in thousands of places? Ehrman and other skeptics will usually throw out the fact that there are 400,000 variants across New Testament manuscripts, which is in fact true. However, when you look at the details, this isn't a big deal. For example, the reason we have so many variants is because we have so many manuscripts. That would be expected with such a high number of manuscripts. But even with that, remember we have close to 6,000 New Testament Greek manuscripts, which comes to about 2.6 million pages of New Testament. If you do the math, that is one variant per 6.5 pages. Not really that much. Second, what kinds of variants are there? Well, 75% of them are simply spelling errors, which do not affect the meaning of the text. 15% are variation in Greek synonyms and transpositions, which cannot even be translated. About 9% do affect the meaning of the text, but they are from very late documents, and obviously resolved by looking at earlier manuscripts. Then, less than 1% do actually affect the meaning of the text and are from early manuscripts. But none of these variants actually challenge or affect essential Christian doctrines, as Bart Ehrman even admits. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament.
This is the guy on whose works Muslims and atheists are basing their wild claims that the Orthodox have so corrupted the text that it must not have been Orthodox at all originally. They don't know what they're talking about, but they're basing it on Dr. Ehrman's work. He does know what he's talking about. I happen to disagree with him about a number of things, but I don't disagree with him over this. In fact, in our 3 debates, at the end of each debate, I say, by the way, I think you agree with me, Bart, that essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants. And I put this screen up. He's never disputed it. He said it. It's in print. He can't deny himself.
There is absolutely no evidence to suggest Christian doctrines are affected by variants in the manuscripts, and there is next to zero evidence to suggest we cannot get back to the originals. In fact, given all the evidence, there are only 40 lines of the New Testament unresolved by textual criticism, giving it an accuracy of 99.5%, which by far is the best of any ancient document, Now obviously, there is still debate over what a handful of passages were originally, and no Christian scholar argues we have exactly word for word what the original authors wrote. But in light of this evidence, we should also avoid radical skepticism that we can certainly never know anything of what the original authors wrote. It simply doesn't stand up to evidence. The overwhelming amount of scriptural passages aren't even debated, and there is no textual evidence that threatens the origins of essential Christian doctrines. So is the New Testament reliable? The obvious answer is yes, and we have barely scratched the surface of evidence.
The onus is on the skeptic. The New Testament sets the standard in providing clear evidence of its trustworthiness. If that is not enough, is it possible the skeptic has set a standard that is unreasonable? And if so, why?